Before we get into the book, let's talk about today's musical selection, as we often do. And by often, I mean daily. We talk about this every day that I do this. So today, the treat I have for you is this is another record from the Symphonic Treasures collection. This is album number 15, and it's Strauss Waltzes in Hi-Fi. So we're going to listen to some Strauss Waltzes in Hi-Fi. And this is where I need to issue a nerd warning, because this might cause some heads to explode. Listening to Strauss waltzes means we're probably going to hear some music that we generally associate, well, us nerds anyway, generally associate with 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yet I'm going to be reading from Star Wars, so you might hear some music that you're like, oh no, 2001, that's great. Wait, why are we hearing Star Wars stuff? So hopefully your brain can handle that, and we'll, whatever. Hopefully your mind won't explode too hard. So let's get some music on and get into the book. Cheers, my friends. Vader stared at the motley array of stars displayed on the conference room map, while Tarkin and Admiral Motti conferred nearby. Interestingly, the first use of the most powerful destructive machine ever constructed, it seemingly had no influence at all on that map, which in itself represented only a tiny fraction of this section of the modest-sized galaxy. It would take a micro breakdown of a portion of this map to reveal a slight reduction in spatial mass caused by the disappearance of Alderaan. Alderaan, with its many cities, farms, factories, and towns, and traders, Vader reminded himself. Despite his advances and intricate technological methods of annihilation, the actions of mankind remained unnoticeable to an uncaring, unimaginably vast universe. If Vader's grandest plans ever came to pass, all that would change. He was well aware that despite all their intelligence and drive, the vastness and wonder were lost on the two men who continued to chatter monkey-like behind him. Tarkin and Motti were talented and ambitious, but they saw things only on the scale of human pettiness. It was a pity, Vader thought, that they did not possess the scope to match their abilities. Still, neither man was a Dark Lord. As such, little more could be expected of them. These two were useful now, and dangerous, but someday they, like Alderaan, would have to be swept aside. For now, he could not afford to ignore them, and while he would have preferred the company of equals, he had to admit reluctantly that at this point he had no equals. Nonetheless, he turned to them and insinuated himself into their conversation.
The defense systems on Alderaan, despite the Senator's protestations to the contrary, were as strong as any in the Empire. I should conclude that our demonstration was as impressive as it was thorough.
Tarkin turned to him, nodding. The Senate is being informed of our action at this very moment. Soon we will be able to announce the extermination of the Alliance itself, as soon as we have dealt with their main military base. Now that their main source of munitions, Alderaan, has been eliminated, the rest of those systems with secessionist inclinations will fall in line quickly enough. You'll see. Tarkin turned as an Imperial officer entered the chamber. Yes? What is it, Cass? The unlikely officer wore the expression of the mouse chosen to bell the cat. Governor, the advance scouts have reached and circumnavigated Dantooine. They have found the remains of a rebel base, which they estimate has been deserted for some time. Years, possibly. They're proceeding with an extensive survey of the remainder of the system. Tarkin turned apologetic, his face darkening to a fine pomegranate fury. She lied! She lied to us! No one could see, but it seemed that Vader must have smiled behind his mask.
Then we are even in the first exchange of truths. I told you she would never betray the rebellion, unless she thought her confession could somehow destroy us in the process.
Terminate her immediately. The governor was barely able to form words.
Calm yourself, Tarkin,
Vader advised him.
You would throw away our only link to the real rebel base so casually? She can still be of value to us.
You just said it yourself, Vader. We'll get nothing more out of her. I'll find that hidden fortress if I have to destroy every star system in this sector. A quiet yet demanding beep interrupted him. Yes, what is it? He inquired irritably. A voice reported over an unseen speaker. Sirs, we've captured a small freighter that was entering the remains of Alderaan. A standard check indicates that its markings apparently match that of a ship which blasted its way out of the quarantine at Mos Eisley. Wow. The Mos Eisley Tatooine system, and went hyper before the Imperial blockade craft there could close in on it. Tarkin looked puzzled. Mos Eisley? Tatooine? What is this? What is this all about, Vader?
It means, Tarkin, that the last of our unresolved difficulties is about to be eliminated. Someone apparently received the missing data tapes, learned who transcribed them, and was trying to return them to her. We may be able to facilitate their meeting with the senator.
Tarkin started to say something, hesitated, then nodded in understanding. How convenient. I leave this matter in your hands, Vader. The Dark Lord bowed slightly, a gesture which Tarkin acknowledged with a perfunctory salute. Then he spun and strode from the room, leaving Mati, looking from man to man in confusion. The freighter sat listlessly in the docking hangar of the huge bay. 30 armed Imperial troopers stood before the lowered main ramp leading into the ship. They snapped to attention when Vader and a commander approached. Vader halted at the base of the ramp, studying the vessel as an officer and several soldiers came forward. There is no reply to our repeated signals, sir, so we activated the ramp from outside. We've made no contact with anyone on board, either by communicator or in person, the officer reported.
Send your men in,
Vader ordered. Turning, the officer relayed the command to a non-com, who barked orders. A number of the heavily armored soldiers made their way up the small ramp and entered the outer hold. They advanced, with appreciable caution. Inside, two men covered a third as he advanced. Moving in groups of 3 in this fashion, they rapidly spread through the ship. Corridors rang hollowly under metal-shod feet, and doors slid aside willingly as they were activated. Empty, the sergeant in charge finally declared in surprise. Check the cockpit. Several troopers made their way forward and slid the portal aside, only to discover the pilot's chair is as vacant as the rest of the freighter. The controls were deactivated and all systems shut down. Only a single light on the console winked on and off futilely. The sergeant moved forward, recognized the source of the light, and activated the appropriate controls. A printout appeared on a nearby screen. He studied it intently, then turned to convey the information to his superior. He was waiting by the main hatch. That worthy listened carefully before he turned and called down to the commander and Vader. There is no one aboard the ship. The ship is completely deserted, sirs. According to the ship's log, her crew abandoned ship immediately after liftoff, then sent her automatics for Alderaan. Possibly a decoy, the commander ventured aloud. Then they should still be on Tatooine.
Possibly,
Vader admitted reluctantly. Several of the escape pods have been jettisoned, the officer went on.
Did you find any droids on board?
Vader called. No, sir, nothing. If there were any, they must have abandoned the ship along with the organic crew. Vader hesitated before replying. When he did so, uncertainty was evident in his voice.
This doesn't feel right. Send a fully equipped scanning team on board. I want every centimeter of that ship checked out. See to it as soon as possible.
With that, he whirled and stalked from the hangar. pursued by the infuriating feel that he was overlooking something of vital importance. The rest of the assembled soldiers were dismissed by the officer. On board the freighter, a last one figure left off examining the space beneath the cockpit consoles and ran to join his comrades. He was anxious to be off this ghost ship and back in the comfortable surroundings of the barracks. His heavy footsteps echoed through the once more empty freighter. Below, the muffled sounds of the officer giving final orders faded, leaving the interior in complete quiet. The quivering of a portion of the floor was the only movement on board. Abruptly, the quivering became a sharp upheaval. Two metal panels popped upward, followed by a pair of tousled heads. Han Solo and Luke looked around quickly, then managed to relax a little when it became clear that the ship was empty, just as empty as it sounded. "Lucky you built these compartments," Luke commented. Solo is not as cheerily confident. "Where did you think I kept smuggled goods? In the main hold? I admit I never expected to smuggle myself in them." He started violently at a sudden sound, but it was only another of the panels shifting aside. "This is ridiculous. It isn't going to work. Even if I could take off and get past the closed hatch." He jabbed a thumb upward. "We'd never get past that tractor beam." Another panel opened, revealing the face of an elderly imp. "You leave that to me." "I was afraid you'd say something like that," muttered Solo. "You're a damned fool, old man." Kenobi grinned at him. "What does that say of the man who allows himself to be hired by a fool?" Solo muttered something under his breath as they pulled themselves clear of the compartments, Chewbacca doing so with a good deal of grunting and twisting. The technicians had arrived at the base of the ramp. They reported to the two board soldiers guarding it. "The ship's all yours," one of the troopers told them. "If the scanners pick up anything, report it immediately." The men nodded, then strained to lug their heavy equipment up the ramp. As soon as they disappeared inside, a loud crash was heard. Both guards whirled and heard a voice call, "Hey down there, could you give us a hand with this?" One trooper looked at his companion, who shrugged. They both started up the ramp, muttering at the inefficiency of mere technicians. A second crashing sound reverberated, but now there was no one left to hear it. But the absence of the two troopers was noticed soon thereafter. A gantry officer passing the window of a small command office near the freighter entrance glanced out, frowning when he saw no sign of the guards. Concerned but not alarmed, he moved to a comlink and spoke into it as he continued to stare at the ship. "THX 1138, why aren't you at your post?" "THX 1138, do you copy?" The speaker gave back only static. "THX 1138, why don't you reply?" The officer was beginning to panic when an armored figure descended the ramp and waved toward him, pointing to the portion of his helmet covering his right ear. The figure tapped it to indicate the comlink inside wasn't working. Shaking his head in disgust, the gantry officer gave his busy aide an annoyed look as he made for the door. "Take over here. We've got another bad transmitter. I'm going to see what I can do." He activated the door, took a step forward as it slid aside, and stumbled backward in a state of shock. Filling the door completely was a towering, hairy form. Chewbacca leaned inward, and with a bone-splintering howl, flattened the bemuddled officer with one swipe of a pan-sized fist. The aide was already on his feet and reaching for his sidearm when a narrow energy beam passed completely through him, piercing his heart. Solo flipped up the faceplate of his trooper helmet, then slid it back into place as he followed the Wookiee into the room. Kenobi and the droids squeezed in behind him, with Luke, also clad in the armor of a luckless Imperial soldier, bringing up the rear. Luke was looking around nervously as he shut the door behind them. "Between his howling and your blasting everything in sight, it's a wonder the entire station doesn't know we're here." "Bring him on," Solo demanded, unreasonably enthused by the success so far. "I prefer a straight-up fight to all this sneaking around." "Maybe you're in a hurry to die," Luke snapped, "but I'm not. All this sneaking around has kept us alive." The Corellian gave Luke a sour eye, but said nothing. They watched as Kenobi operated an incredibly complex computer console with the ease and confidence of one long accustomed to handling intricate machinery. A screen lit up promptly with a map of sections of the battle station. The old man leaned forward, scrutinizing the display carefully. Meanwhile, Threepio and R2 had been going over an equally complicated control panel nearby. R2 suddenly froze and began whistling wildly at something he had found. Solo and Luke, their momentary disagreement over tactics forgotten, rushed over to see where the robots were standing. Chewbacca busied himself hanging the gantry officer up by his toes. Put him in, Kenobi suggested, looking over from his place before the larger readout. He should be able to draw information from the entire station network. Let's see if he can find out where the tractor beam power unit is located. Why not just disconnect the beam from here, sir? Luke wanted to know. It was Solo who replied derisively. What? And have them lock it right back on us before we can get a ship's length outside the docking bay? Luke looked crestfallen. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. We have to break the tractor at its power source in order to execute a clean escape, Luke. Old Ben chided gently as R2 punched a claw arm into the open computer socket he had discovered. Immediately, a galaxy of lights came to life on the panel in front of him, and the room was filled with the hum of machinery working at high speed. Several minutes passed while the little droid sucked up information like a metal sponge. Then the hum slowed, and he turned to beep something back at them.
He's found it, sir,
Threepio announced excitedly.
The tractor beam is coupled to the main reactors at 7 locations. Most of the pertinent data is restricted, but he'll try to pull the critical information through to the monitor.
Kenobi turned his attention from the larger screen to a small readout near R2. Data began to race across it too fast for Luke to see, but apparently Kenobi somehow made something of the schematic blur. I don't think there's any way you boys can help with this, he told them. I must go alone. That suits me fine, said Solo readily. I've already done more than I bargained for on this trip. But I think putting that tractor beam out of commission is going to take more than your magic, old man. Luke wasn't put off so easily. I want to go with you. Don't be impatient, young Luke. This requires skills you haven't yet mastered. Stay and watch over the droids, and wait for my signal. They must be delivered to the rebel forces, or many more worlds will meet the same fate as Alderaan. Trust in the Force, Luke, and wait. With a last look at the flow of information on the monitor, Kenobi adjusted the lightsaber at his waist. Stepping to the door, he slid it aside, looked once left, once right, and disappeared down a long, glowing hallway. As soon as he was gone, Chewbacca growled something, and Solo nodded in agreement. You said it, Chewie. He turned to Luke. Where'd you dig up that old fossil? Ben Kenobi, General Kenobi, is a great man, Luke protested loftily. Yeah, great at getting us into trouble, Solo snorted. General my afterburners. He's not going to get us out of here. You got any better ideas? Luke shot back challengingly. Anything would be better than just waiting here for them to come back and pick us up. A hysterical whistling and hooting came from the computer console. Luke hurried himself over to R2-D2. The little droid was all but hopping up and down on his stubby legs. What now? Luke asked Threepio. The taller robot looked puzzled himself.
I'm afraid I don't understand either, sir. He says I found her, and keeps repeating, she's here, she's here.
Who? Who's he found? R2 turned a flat blinking face toward Luke and whistled frantically.
Princess Leia,
Threepio announced after listening carefully.
Senator Organa, they seem to be one and the same. I believe she may be the person in the message he was carrying.
That three-dimensional portrait of indescribable beauty coalesced in Luke's mind again. The princess? She's here? Attracted by the commotion, Solo wandered over. Princess? What's going on? Where? Where's she? Luke demanded breathlessly, ignoring Solo completely. R2 whistled on while Threepio translated.
Level 5, detention block AA23. According to the information, she is scheduled for slow termination.
No! We've got to do something. What are you three blabbering about? An exasperated Solo demanded. She's the one who programmed the message into R2-D2, Luke explained hurriedly. The one we were trying to deliver to Alderaan. We've got to help her. Now, just a minute, Solo cautioned him. This is going awful fast for me. Don't get any funny ideas. When I said I didn't have any better ideas, I meant it. The old man said to wait here. I don't like it, but I'm not going off on some crazy maze through this place. But Ben didn't know she was here, Luke half pleaded, half argued. I'm sure that if he knew, he would have changed his plans. Anxiety turned to thoughtfulness. Now, if we could just figure a way to get into that detention block. Solo shook his head and stepped back. I'm not going into any Imperial detention blocks. If we don't do something, they're going to execute her. A minute ago, you said you didn't want to just sit here and wait. Now all you want to do is stay? Which is it, Han? The Corellian looked troubled and confused. Marching into a detention area is not what I had in mind. We're likely to end up in there anyway. Why rush it? But they're going to execute her. Better her than me. Where's your sense of chivalry, Han? Solo considered. Near as I can recall, I traded it for 10-carat chrysopaz and 3 bottles of good brandy about 5 years ago on Commonor. I've seen her, Luke persisted desperately. She's beautiful. So's life. She's a rich, powerful senator, Luke pressed, hoping an appeal to Solo's baser instincts might be more effective. If we could save her, the reward might be quite substantial. Rich? Then Solo looked disdainful. Wait a minute. Reward? From who? From the government on Alderaan? He made a sweeping gesture toward the hangar, and by implication, the space where Alderaan had once orbited. Luke thought furiously. If she's being held here and is scheduled to be executed, that means she must be dangerous in some way to whoever destroyed Alderaan. To whatever had this station built. You can bet it had something to do with the Empire, instituting a reign of full repression. I'll tell you who'll pay for her rescue and for the information she holds. The Senate, the Rebel Alliance, and every concern that did business with Alderaan. She could be the sole surviving heir of the off-world wealth of the entire system. The reward could be, well, more wealth than you could imagine. I don't know. I can imagine quite a bit. Han glanced at Chewbacca, who grunted a terse reply. Solo shrugged back at the big Wookiee. All right, we'll give it a try, but you'd better be right about that reward. What's your plan, kid? Luke was momentarily taken back. All his energies up until now had been trying to convince or persuade Solo and Chewbacca to aid in the rescue attempt. With that accomplished, Luke became aware he actually had no idea how to proceed. He had grown used to old Ben and Solo giving directions. Now the next move was up to him. Ooh, a little bit of character growth going on here. And also, the side of our record has ended. Let's take a break real quick and flip the record over. His eyes were caught by several metal circlets dangling from the belt of Solo's armor. Give me those binders and tell Chewbacca to come over here. Solo handed Luke the thin but quite unbreakable cuffs and relayed the request to Chewbacca. The Wookiee lumbered over and stood waiting next to Luke. Now, I'm going to just put these on you, Luke began, starting to move behind the Wookiee with the cuffs, and Chewbacca made a sound low in his throat, and Luke jumped in spite of himself. Now, he began again, Han is going to put these on you, and he sheepishly handed the binders to Solo, uncomfortably aware of the enormous anthropod's glowing eyes on him. Solo sounded amused as he moved forward. Don't worry, Chewie. I think I know what he has in mind. The cuffs already fit around the thick wrists. Despite his partner's seeming confidence in the plan, the Wookiee wore a worried, frightened look as the restraints were activated.
Luke, sir.
Luke looked over at Threepio.
Pardon me for asking, but, what should Artoo and I do if someone discovers us here in your absence?
Hope they don't have blasters, Solo replied. Threepio's tone indicated he didn't find the answer humorous.
That isn't very reassuring.
Solo and Luke were too engrossed in their coming expedition to pay much attention to the worried robot. They adjusted their helmets. Then, with Chewbacca wearing a half-real downcast expression, they started off along the corridor where Ben Kenobi had previously disappeared. And thus concludes Chapter 8. Now we move on to Chapter 9. As they traveled farther and deeper into the bowels of the gigantic station, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain an air of casual confidence. Fortunately, those who might have sensed some nervousness on the part of the two armored troopers would regard it as only natural, considering their huge, dangerous Wookiee captive. Chewbacca also made it impossible for the two young men to be as inconspicuous as they would have liked. The farther they traveled, the heavier the traffic became. Other soldiers, bureaucrats, technicians, and mechanics hustled around them. Intent on their own assignments, they ignored the trio completely, only a few of the humans sparing the Wookiee a curious glance. Chewbacca's morose expression and the seeming confidence of his captors reassured the inquisitive. Eventually, they reached a wide bank of elevators. Luke breathed a sigh of relief. The computer-controlled transport ought to be capable of taking them just about anywhere on the station in response to a verbal command. There was a nervous second when a major official raced to get aboard. Solo gestured sharply, and the other, without voicing a protest, shifted to the next elevator tube in line. Luke studied the operating panel, then tried to sound at once knowledgeable and important as he spoke into the pickup grid. Instead, he sounded nervous and scared, but the elevator was a pure response mechanism, not programmed to differentiate the appropriateness of emotions conveyed vocally. So the door slid shut, and they were on their way. After what felt like hours, but was in reality only minutes, the door opened, and they stepped out into the security area. It had been Luke's hope they would discover something like the old-fashioned barred cells of the kind used on Tatooine in towns like Mos Eisley. Instead, they saw only narrow ramps bordering a bottomless ventilation shaft. These walkways, several levels of them, ran parallel to smooth curving walls, which held faceless detention cells. Alert-looking guards and energy gates seemed to be everywhere they looked. Uncomfortably aware that the longer they stood frozen in place, the sooner someone was bound to come over and ask unanswerable questions, Luke searched frantically for a course of action. "This isn't going to work," Solo whispered, leaning toward him. "Why didn't you say that before?" a frustrated, frightened Luke shot back. "I think I did. Shh." Solo shut up as Luke's worst fears were realized. A tall, grim-looking officer approached them. He frowned as he examined the silent Chewbacca. "Where are you going with this thing?" Chewbacca snarled at the remark, and Solo quieted him with a hasty jab in the ribs. A panicky Luke found himself replying almost instinctively. Prisoner transfer from block TS-138. The officer looked puzzled. "I wasn't notified. I'll have to clear it." Turning, the man walked to a small console nearby and began entering his request. Luke and Han hurriedly surveyed the situation, their gaze traveling from alarms, energy gates, and remote photo sensors to the three other guards stationed in the area. Solo nodded to Luke as he unfastened Chewbacca's cuffs. Then he whispered something to the Wookiee. An ear-splitting howl shook the corridor as Chewbacca threw up both hands, grabbing Solo's rifle from him. "Look out!" a seemingly terrified Solo shouted. "It's loose! It'll rip us apart!" Both he and Luke darted clear of the rampaging Wookiee, pulled out their pistols, and were blasting away at them. Their reaction was excellent, their enthusiasm undeniable, and their aim execrable. Not a single shot came close to the dodging Wookiee. Instead, they blasted automatic cameras, energy rate controls, and the three dumbfounded guards. At this point, it occurred to the officer in charge that the abominable aim of those two soldiers was a bit too selectively efficient. He was preparing to jab the general alarm when a burst from Luke's pistol caught him in the midsection, and he fell without a word to the gray deck. Solo rushed to the open comlink speaker. which was screeching anxious questions about what was going on. Apparently, there were audio as well as visual links between this detention station and elsewhere. Ignoring the barrage of alternate threats and queries, he checked the readout in the panel nearby. We've got to find out which cell this princess of yours is in. There must be a dozen levels, and oh, here it is, cell 2187. Go on, Chewie. Go on. Chewie and I'll hold him off. Luke nodded once and was racing down the narrow walkway. After gesturing for the Wookiee to take a position where he could cover the elevators, Solo took a deep breath and responded to the unceasing calls from the comlink. Everything's under control, he said into the pickup, sounding reasonably official. Situation's normal. It didn't sound like that, a voice snapped back in a no-nonsense tone. What happened? One of the guards experienced a weapons malfunction, Solo stammered, his temporary officialese lapsing into nervousness. No problem now. We're all fine, thanks. How about you? We're sending a squad up, the voice announced suddenly. Han could almost smell the suspicion at the other end. What to say? He spoke more eloquently with the business end of a pistol. Negative. We have an energy leak. Give us a few minutes to lock it down. Large leak. Very, very dangerous. Weapons malfunction? Energy leak? Who is this? What's your operating? Pointing his pistol at the panels, Solo blew the instrumentation to silent scraps. It was a dumb conversation anyway, he murmured. Turning, he shouted down the corridor. Hurry it up, Luke. We're going to have some company. Luke heard, but he was absorbed in running from one cell to the next and studying the numbers glowing above each doorway. The cell, 2187, it appeared, did not exist. But it did, and he found it just as he was about to give up and try the next level down. For a long moment, he examined the featureless convex metal wall, turning his pistol to maximum and hoping it wouldn't melt in his hands before it broke through. He opened fire on the door. When the weapon became too hot to hold, he tossed it from hand to hand. As he did so, the smoke had time to clear, and he saw with some surprise that the door had been blown away. Peering through the smoke with an uncomprehending look on her face was the young woman whose portrait R2-D2 had projected in the garage on Tatooine several centuries ago, or so it seemed. She was even more beautiful than her image, Luke decided, staring dazedly at her. You're even more beautiful than I... Her look of confusion and uncertainty was replaced by first puzzlement and then impatience. Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper? She finally commented. What? Oh, the uniform. He removed the helmet, regaining a little composure at the same time. I've come to rescue you. I'm Luke Skywalker. I beg your pardon, she said politely. I said I've come to rescue you. Ben Kenobi is with me. We've got your two droids. The uncertainty was instantly replaced by hope at the mention of the oldster's name. Ben Kenobi? She looked around at Luke, ignoring him as she searched for the Jedi. Where is he? Where's Obi-Wan? Governor Tarkin watched as Darth Vader paced rapidly back and forth in the otherwise empty conference room. Finally, the Dark Lord paused, glancing around as though a great bell only he could hear had rung somewhere close by.
He is here,
Vader stated unemotionally. Tarkin looked startled. Obi-Wan Kenobi? That's impossible. What makes you think so?
A stirring in the Force of a kind I've felt only in the presence of my old master. It is unmistakable.
Surely he must be dead by now. Vader hesitated, his assurance suddenly gone.
Perhaps. It is gone now. It was only a brief sensation.
The Jedi are extinct, declared Tarkin positively. Their fire was quenched decades ago. You, my friend, are all that's left of their ways. A comlink buzzed softly for attention. Yes, Tarkin acknowledged. We have an emergency alert in detention block AA-23. The princess? Tarkin yelped, jumping to his feet. Vader whirled, trying to stare through the walls.
I knew it. Obi-Wan is here. I knew I could not mistake a stirring in the Force of such power.
But all sections on alert, Tarkin ordered through the comlink. Then he turned to stare at Vader. If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape.
Escape may not be Obi-Wan Kenobi's intention,
Vader replied, struggling to control his emotions.
He is the last of the Jedi, and the greatest. The danger he presents to us must not be underestimated. Yet only I can deal with him.
His head snapped around to stare fixedly at Tarkin.
Alone.
Luke and Leia had started back up the corridor when a series of blinding explosions ripped the walkway ahead of them. Several troopers had tried coming through the elevator, only to be crisped one after another by Chewbacca. Disdaining the elevators, they had blasted a gaping hole through a wall. The opening was too large for Solo and the Wookiee to cover completely. In twos and threes, the Imperials were working their way into the detention block. Retreating down the walkway, Han and Chewbacca encountered Luke and the Princess. We can't go back that way, Solo told them, his face flushed with the excitement and worry. No, it looks like you've managed to cut off our only escape route, Leia agreed readily. This is a detention area, you know. They don't build them with multiple exits. Breathing heavily, Solo turned to look her up and down. Begging your forgiveness, Your Highness, he said sarcastically, but maybe you'd prefer if we just put you back in your cell. She looked away, her face impassive. There's got to be another way out, Luke muttered, pulling a small transmitter unit from his belt and carefully adjusting the frequency. C-3PO! C-3PO! A familiar voice responded with gratifying speed.
Yes, sir?
We've been cut off here. Are there any other ways out of this detention area? Anything at all? Static crackled over the tiny grid as Solo and Chewbacca kept the Imperial troops bolted up at the other end of the walkway.
What was that? I didn't copy.
Back in the gantry office, R2-D2 beeped and whistled frantically as 3PO adjusted controls, fighting to clear the awkward transmission.
I said all systems have been alerted to your presence, sir. The main entry seems to be the only way in or out of the cell block.
He pressed instruments, and the view of the nearby readouts changed steadily.
All other information on your section is restricted.
Someone began banging on the locked door to the office. Evenly at first, and then, when no response was forthcoming from within, more insistently.
Oh no!
3PO groaned. The smoke in the cell corridor was now so intense that it was difficult for Solo and Chewbacca to pick their targets. That was fortunate inasmuch as they were now badly outnumbered, and the smoke confused the Imperials' fire with equal thoroughness. Every so often, one of the soldiers would attempt to move closer, only to stand exposed as he penetrated the smoke. Under the accurate fire of the two smugglers, he would rapidly join the accumulating mass of motionless figures on the rampway flooring. Energy bolts continued to ricochet wildly through the block as Luke moved close to Solo. There isn't any other way out, he yelled over the deafening roar of concentrated fire. Well, they're closing in on us. What do we do now? This is some rescue, an irritated voice complained from behind them. Both men turned to see a thoroughly disgusted princess eyeing them with regal disapproval. When you came in here, you didn't have a plan for getting out? She nodded toward Luke. He's the brain. Oh, Solo nodded toward Luke. He's the brains, sweetheart. Luke managed an embarrassed grin and shrugged helplessly. He turned to help return the fire, but before he could do so, the princess had snatched the pistol from his hand. Hey! Luke stared as she moved along the wall, finally locating a small grate nearby. She pointed the pistol at it and fired. Solo gazed at her in disbelief. What do you think you're doing? It looks like it's up to me to save our skins. Get into that garbage chute, flyboy. While the others looked on in amazement, she jumped feet first into the opening and disappeared. Chewbacca rumbled threateningly, but Solo slowly shook his head. No, Chewie, I don't want you to rip her apart. I'm not sure about her yet. Either I'm beginning to like her, or I'm going to kill her myself. The Wookiee snorted something else, and Solo yelled back at him. Go on in, you furry oaf. I don't care what you smell. This is no time to go dainty on me. Shoving the reluctant Wookiee toward the tiny opening, Solo helped jam the massive bulk through. As soon as he disappeared, the Corellian followed him in. Luke fired off a last series of blasts, more in the hope of creating a covering smoke than hitting anything. Then he slid into the chute and was gone. Not wanting to incur further losses in such confined space, the pursuing soldiers had momentarily halted to await the arrival of reinforcements and heavier weapons. Besides, they had their quarry trapped, and despite their dedication, none of them were anxious to die needlessly. The chamber Luke tumbled into was dimly lit, not that the light was needed to discern its contents. He smelled the decay long before he dumped into it. Unadorned except for the concealed illuminants, the garbage room was at least a quarter full of slimy muck, much of which had already achieved a state of decomposition sufficient to wrinkle Luke's nose. Solo was stumbling around the edge of the room, slipping and sinking up to his knees in the uncertain footing in an attempt to locate an exit. All he found was a small, thick hatchway, which he grunted and heaved to pry open. The hatch cover refused to budge. The garbage chute was a wonderful idea, he told the princess sardonically, wiping the sweat from his forehead. What an incredible smell you've discovered. Unfortunately, we can't ride out of here on drifting odor, and there doesn't seem to be any other exit, unless I can get this hatch open. Stepping back, he pulled his pistol and fired at the cover. The bolt promptly went howling around the room as everyone sought cover in the garbage. A last glance, and the bolt detonated almost on top of them. Looking less dignified by the moment, Leia was the first to emerge from the pungent cover. Put that thing away, she told Solo grimly, or you're going to get us all killed. Yes, your worship, Solo muttered in snide supplication. He made no move to reholster his weapon as he glanced back up toward the door in the chute above. It won't take long for them to figure out what happened to us. We had things well under control up there until you let us down here. Oh, sure you did, she shot back, brushing refuse from her hair and shoulders. Brushing refuse from her hair and shoulders. Well, it could be worse. As if in reply, a piercing, horrible moaning filled the room. It seemed to come from somewhere beneath them. Chewbacca let out a terrified yowl of his own and tried to flatten himself against a wall. Luke drew his own pistol and peered hard at various clumps of debris, but saw nothing. What was that? Solo asked. I'm not too sure. Luke suddenly jumped, looking down behind him. Something just moved past me, I think. Watch out. With shocking suddenness, Luke disappeared straight down into the garbage. It's got Luke, the princess shouted. It took him under. Solo looked around frantically for something to shoot at. As sharply as he had vanished, Luke reappeared, and so did part of something else. A thick, whitish tentacle was wrapped around his throat. Shoot it! Kill it! Luke screamed. Shoot it! I can't even see it! Solo protested. Once again, Luke was sucked under by whatever the gruesome appendage was attached to. Solo stared helplessly around the multicolored surface. There was a distant rumble of heavy machinery, and two opposing walls of the chamber moved inward several centimeters. The rumble ceased, and then it was quiet again. Luke appeared unexpectedly close to Solo, scrabbling his way clear of the suffocating mess and rubbing at the welt on his neck. What happened to it? Leia wondered, eyeing the quiescent garbage warily. Luke looked genuinely puzzled. I don't know, it had me, and then I was free. It just let me go and disappeared. Maybe I didn't smell bad enough for it. I've got a very bad feeling about this, Solo murmured. Again, the distant rumble filled the room. Again, the walls began their inward march. Only this time, neither sound nor movement showing any signs of stopping. Don't just stand there gaping at each other, the princess urged them. Try to brace the walls with something. Even with the thick poles and old metal beams Chewbacca could handle, they were unable to find anything capable of slowing the walls' advance. It seemed as if the stronger the object that was placed against the walls, the easier it was snapped. Luke pulled out his comlink, simultaneously trying to talk and will the walls to retreat. Threepio, come in! Threepio! A decent pause produced no response, causing Luke to look worriedly at his companions. I don't know why he doesn't answer, he tried again. C-3PO, come in! Do you read? C-3PO, the muted voice continued to call. Come in, C-3PO. It was Luke's voice, and it issued softly in between buzzings from the small hand comlink resting on the deserted computer console. Save for the intermittent pleading, the gantry office was quiet. Tremendous explosion drowned out the muffled pleadings. It blew the office door clean across the room, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. Several of them struck the comlink, sending it flying to the floor and cutting off Luke's voice in mid-transmission. In the wake of the minor cataclysm, four armed and ready troopers entered through the blown portal. Initial study indicated the office was deserted, until a dim, frightened voice was heard coming from one of the tall supply cabinets near the back of the room.
Help! Help! Let us out!
Several of the troopers bent to inspect the immobile bodies of the gantry officer and his aide, while others opened the noisy cabinet. Two robots, one tall and humanoid, the other purely mechanical and three-legged, stepped out into the office. The taller one gave the impression of being half unbalanced with fear.
They're madmen, I tell you! Madmen!
He gestured urgently toward the doorway.
I think they said something about heading for the prison level. They just left. If you hurry, you might catch them. That way! That way!
Two of the troopers inside joined those waiting in the hallway and hustling off down the corridor. That left two guards to watch over the office. They totally ignored the robots as they discussed what might have taken place.
All this excitement has overloaded the circuitry in my companion here,
Threepio explained carefully.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take him down to maintenance.
One of the guards looked up indifferently and nodded to the robot. Threepio and Artoo hurried out the door without looking back. As they departed, it occurred to the guard that the taller of the two droids was of a type he had never seen before. He shrugged. That was not surprising on a station of this size.
That was too close,
Threepio muttered as they scurried down an empty corridor.
Now we'll have to find another information control console and plug you back in, or everything is lost.
And with this break and the end of the record, I'm going to conclude for the evening. My friends, thank you once again for listening. And I will see you tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern, as we find out how they escaped from this terrible mess they're in. Of course, none of us already knows this because we're hearing this for the first time, right? It's not like they made this into a super successful movie that launched a cultural revolution. So you're just going to have to tune in at 5 p.m. tomorrow to find out what happens to our heroes in this space opera we are making our way through. Thanks again. I'll see you tomorrow.